can't hear it, but what these women are doing here is called water drumming. It's a practice that's seen in a lot of places in the South Pacific, other parts of Asia and Africa, and they essentially are just hitting the water to make noise. I'm not going to play the other ones at the moment because I don't have the audio working, but in the bottom here is Inuit throat singing, a practice done by indigenous peoples in the Arctic region. And then in the bottom right corner is some Tongans doing song and dance. And then above here is a site in Vietnam. And these are, yes.
As Raj was wondering, for the ritual one, does it mean anything? Like, what are they doing essentially?
So, it depends. I don't know the specific group that's being, depicted in this video. I believe it's a group off of the coast of Papua New Guinea. Sometimes people engage in ritual for different reasons. Sometimes for paying homage to a deity. Sometimes it could be as simple as just passing the time and having, a form of community and doing something together. But these are also considered heritage. They're intangible components of heritage. They're the things that are not as visible and are more nuanced and harder to describe, but are indeed heritage. They definitely are, components of identity or a people. So when we talk about cultural heritage, we're not just talking about physical places, but we can also be having a dialogue talking about different types of heritage from art, music, dance, and song. Oops. How did I don't know why it changed. So, what is a cultural resource? Here are some definitions. And I provide multiple definitions from different experts because it can be, at times, difficult to define. As we talked about, there are different types of heritage. So one definition is cultural resource management archaeology is the practice of archaeology to carry out legal or policy mandates pursuant to some large undertaking, which refers to as like a typical construction project. Or cultural resource management is the range of activities aimed at understanding, preserving, and providing for the enjoyment of cultural resources. That's the definition provided by the National Park Services. Cultural heritage management is a form of archaeology which operates within the framework of federal, state, local laws, regulations, and guidances. Cultural resource management involves inventorying sites, evaluating them, and sometimes mitigating, very important, the adverse effects of development projects and construction. And then CRM is managing all social cultural aspects of the environment and all the contemporary world impact onto them. And this last one I think was from your guys' reading, if you had done it, which is that CRM is the process by which historically significant landscapes, structures, buildings, sites, and artifacts are identified, assessed, and cared for, essentially. I put in bold the key standouts for what CRM is. It is a type of archaeology that operates under the law. We work with preservation. We work under federal, state, and local regulations. We inventory sites, and specifically, we attempt to mitigate harm to these sites. So what are cultural resources then? We kind of briefly talked about intangible, tangible heritage resources. So these are some definitions as well. We have cultural resources should be understood as those aspects of the environment, both physical and intangible, so those that we talk about, music, dance, both natural, built, and have cultural value to a group of people. This can include cultural landscapes, or as the reading refers to them and typically referred to by law as traditional cultural properties. TCP is the term we used a lot in the discipline when talking about it in terms of legal jargon. They are places, objects, structures, and buildings. They can be remains and sites associated with human activity. We talk about that a lot in the context of Native American heritage, sites that are either prehistoric or historic. And then they are tangible entities or cultural practices we've discussed. These can be districts, sites, buildings, structures, objects, all things that are capable of being put on the National Register of Historic Places, which I'll talk about a bit later. So one of the things that I'd really like to get across is where people in cultural resources management or cultural heritage work. What do we do? Where do we work? Well, we work domestically and internationally, depending on your interests in the field. So on the left, we have all the different places that we work domestically, from state archaeologists to cultural resource management firms, which are typically private or public, universities, CAL FIRE. So here's if you know CAL FIRE is, underneath this Caltrans, this is the Caltrans district map. We break our state up into different districts, and each district always employs archaeologists. You're typically working in the field alongside construction workers on California state highways, and because of the laws that govern our state and our resources, you're often working alongside them as they are building and digging. You're not monitoring the construction, and they're always hiring, always. You can also work in the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, Department of Agriculture, Army Corps of Engineers, Defense Department, National Park Services. The list goes on, as you can see. As for internationally, you can work with the United Nations, UNESCO. A lot of countries have a form of government that has a Department of Tourism that they also hire people. And then U.S. embassies, ironically, could also be a place of employment. And these images on the right are all UNESCO World Heritage Sites. You may learn about them later. And here's just a visual of UNESCO that show all the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And it's interesting because it's a moment where you can also take a step back and acknowledge, too, how heritage is also deeply political. Whose heritage matters, who's preserving it, how it gets preserved, and to what point is it preserved. If you look at the distribution of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, ironically, an institution that is supposed to be apolitical to an extent, especially when it comes to this circumstance, you can see that one heritage matters the most, and that's white European heritage. Next being Asia, and it's, drops down everywhere else. So, yes.
Are there differences in the colors of the dots?
Yes, so green dots are actual UNESCO sites that are more physical landscapes. Yellow are cultural resources, and I forget what red is. Because I know you could see Rapa Nui with the Easter Island heads is right there for yellow. So that's a visual of UNESCO's distribution. So there's a lot of work there. And to get nominated, it actually is a nation state or entity within a country that starts the nomination process. UNESCO itself does not actively nominate. So what do we do in general? We do construction site monitoring, as you can see up here and here. We do cultural resource reports, which are technical reports that typically come alongside working in the field. We can manage cultural resource repositories, such as museums, or what we have in the state of California known as historic resource information centers. All reports are stored in a database in the state of California, and it's broken upon different universities. So Sonoma State, we're luckily so close by, we have the Northwest Information Center. So all cultural resource management reports are stored there. And only specific people can have access to them. Usually people who have a master's or a relative degree in that field can access them because they are protected by law, because they are cultural resources and there's a fear of looting. So although they are to be public documents, they're not for the public. We do field investigations and evaluations. We do studies from archaeological sites, historic buildings, historic properties, traditional cultural properties, and we do a lot of consultation. We work alongside tribal governments, federal government, and even the private sector. And here's what we typically will do when we do a report. They're called Departments of Park and Recreation's DPR 523 forms, very technical, because all resources in the state of California are essentially fall under the Department of Parks and Recreations, and they have a system of how you record and document archaeological sites within the state of California. These consist of a primary record form, an archaeological site form or building, location map, sketch map, and then a photo log and or continuation sheets. And I'll give an example of what those look like in a second. And for those who don't know, this is how many state parks we have visually and the zones that we break up our state parks into. Again, each different zone will also typically have its own state archaeologist and their own division, because there's too many to not break it up into parts. So here's an example from a archaeological survey I had done a year ago or so. This is a DPR form. So on the left you have a primary record form. I know it's hard to see, I apologize, but it's essentially just a document where you check some boxes, you provide information from your survey. I had to blank things out for, again, legal purposes. And then on the other side is the archaeological site record form. You can see it's a lot of box checking, and then a lot of just like very like legal jargon wording of things, a lot of describing. You also have to produce maps. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, of course.
I just noticed San Rafael, California on there. Can you tell us a little more about the site?
I can tell you some things, I can't go into specifics, but I was evaluating a homestead from 1890. It was within the state park of Mount Tamalpais.
Wow.
There was a famous artist of the time who had built a home out there, and I had to go find him. Someone had recorded the site in the 90s, and I was essentially going to check up on the site to see what the integrity of the site was today. In which the site was, you can't even see it. This where I'm standing there with another colleague is the flat of the house. That's all that's left. But when you read the 1990 report, there was still actual artifacts and other things left, but everything's gone now. So that's another part of what we do. We sometimes reevaluate sites that haven't been seen in a while and provide it to the state park, because then this report was put to the info center, provided to state parks, to specifically that district, to Mount Tamalpais, and they have now an updated database, so now they can work actively to mitigate harm to that site, because it's actually in a pretty accessible place, which sadly my next map might give away some of those locations if you're familiar with maps. But another technical skill, so those who are interested in the field, I suggest learning how to use ArcMaps. Something I struggle with, but it's very useful because we do produce maps, and then Adobe Illustrate, we use that a lot as well to create whether sketch maps in the past, and you'll see if you ever get in the field, people would do it by hand, and yeah, now most of them are done by either hand in the field, and then when you get back into the office, you'll take up Adobe Illustrate and then open different layers and just kind of do it by hand that way, but are all critical components of the DPR form process. So now I'm going to take a moment to talk about the laws, because, well, how did we get here? So the first real law that governed cultural resources came out of the early 20th century in the year 1906. It was written and signed by the Teddy Roosevelt administration. He's depicted here with John Muir. And that was the Antiquities Act. And essentially what happened was, as Eastern Americans started heading west during Manifest Destiny, they began to encounter these archaeological sites in the Southwest and more indigenous communities. And there was a growing interest among, I guess, the American public to preserve and protect these sites. And Teddy Roosevelt's administration, like I said, signed the first act, which essentially it is the first law that grants the president the power to set aside public land for preservation. So it's not the biggest step forward, but it does allow for the first time the federal government to say this land here cannot be redistricted or repurposed, and it has to be protected for the sake of, the interest in preserving the resources. Shortly after that, the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916 was passed, which just essentially created the National Park System. And then in 1935, we had the Historic Sites Act, which was signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which transferred all federal, properties under the Department of the National Parks and under the authority of the Department of the Interior. It's also the first time that it's codified in law that essentially it is the obligation of the federal government to preserve heritage. It's written in the law that states essentially that it is an obligation of our government to protect these resources. And then finally, in 1966, we have the biggest, one of the biggest impacts to our heritage, which is the National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA. It was passed by Lyndon B. Johnson, and it was essentially, its purpose was to identify and protect historic structures and properties and places that are not just on public lands, but have a national impact on our heritage. So before the laws were only within the jurisdiction of public lands. Now we have a law that says they can be on private land as well. These are now, the government is taking an active role of protecting all national heritage. And it's done through a few different mechanisms. One, the National Register of Historic Places, and it is done through two specific sections of the law, which is Section 106, which requires federal undertakings for projects to evaluate, consider, and factor the cultural resources that could be damaged or threatened in any type of project by the federal government. And Section 110, which essentially says that all federal agencies are to have an inventory of their own cultural resources within the properties they oversee, and that they have to uphold a level of historic integrity. They are responsible for keeping these properties preserved. But this law, as great as it was, as we'll discuss a little bit later, is a kind of feel-good law because it does not prohibit the destruction of sites either. It just mandates that the federal government consult and evaluate. It's more of a process than anything else. At the end of the day, it doesn't prohibit. So the federal government really wanted to. It is more than capable of demolishing a historic site, but luckily the Historic Sites Act does say that if it does, those artifacts need to be preserved somewhere. So it does have some backing. From there we have the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, of 1969, which was passed by Richard Nixon. And this required essentially federal agencies to evaluate how their actions may impact the environment. And it created the component of environmental impact assessment. Pretty much a lot of what we also do are appendices to environmental impact assessments, as the landscape has also like a cultural component to it, in which CRM practitioners do the evaluation for that. So if the federal government is building on a marsh in which there could be an endangered species, you do have biologists doing the environmental impact assessment there, and you also have cultural resource managers alongside them evaluating the historic integrity of the property that's in question under the NEPA. And then These last laws are more about protections. So we have the American Indians Religious Freedom Act of 1978, which essentially provided more rights towards Native groups to access sites of cultural significance, properties, which prior to that, these sites were restricted. So if they're on public lands, they can actually petition to get access to these places, and there's some legal protections. And then the last one being the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, which again, it just kind of codified that destruction to sites comes at a like actual penalty, like $5,000 to $10,000 for looting or destruction of cultural resources. So, since we're in California, we have our own laws. At the beginning of 1970, the state of California tried to improve NEPA by creating its own version, a state version. And they created something called CEQA, the California Environmental Protection Act. This law initially was very similar. It was designed to just evaluate environmental impact. But in 1972, a lawsuit was filed by the Friends of Mammoth versus Mono County because they try to argue that no, these go beyond just state projects, but all projects, and they have to consider cultural resources as well. The law actually agreed with them. The judge said, "You're right." This was again challenged once more in 1977 with the Society of California Archaeology, which I'm a member of, and Butte County. And in this lawsuit, again, they said this also has to do with private properties as well. So if you were a private property owner and you were building a septic tank and you needed to get permission from a county or state government to get the permit, you now fall under CEQA. And you need to do a cultural resource evaluation on your property, for example. So even the smallest local person are being now, evaluated for cultural resources. So this law really changed the fabric of cultural resources, and it actually holds more weight because the biggest difference between NEPA and CEQA is that, again, NEPA, even the NHPA, the National Historic Preservation Act, those laws don't prohibit destruction. CEQA does. CEQA requires that mitigation is taken, and failure to do that could lead to legal penalties and could be sued for failure to mitigate harm to a historic site. So state law holds more weight than the federal law in this case. So I've talked a lot about the National Register, so we're gonna start to dive into that. So the National Register of Historic Places has different criteria that are required for a property, place, site to be nominated. These criteria are right here, the four. So criteria A, which is associated with events that have made significant contributions to a broad pattern of our history. Put that in caption because it's very political, and I'll get to that in a second. Criteria B is a property is associated with the life of a significant person in our past, again. Criteria C embodies the distinct characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, represents a work of a master. We're talking about buildings. And then criteria D, very tailored towards archaeological sites. I don't talk about this one in depth later because it's kind of straightforward. Has yielded or may yield information important to prehistory or history. So a very visible archaeological site is always going to be criteria D for nomination. Other things not as clear. So here is a visual of the National Register of Historic Places by 100 square meters, every county in the United States, and you can see the density of nominations. Does anyone see something that stands out here? Anyone? Visually? Yes.
I see that there's a lot of yellow and I guess red, orange kind of above or in that
This
Right
portion here?
Yeah.
Yeah, on the East Coast. Where is it lacking? Anyone see? Yes.
Nevada.
Yeah, Nevada's one.
Oklahoma, Texas.
Oklahoma, parts of Texas, the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico. And I point this out because, again, if you look at the wording, our heritage, our history, this is where politics gets very involved in archaeology. And it's a moment for us to take a step back and acknowledge this idea of heritage in the United States and whose heritage matters. And we can see here, visually, well, one, this tells us that the national heritage of the United States, what matters is the East Coast. We can start with that on a very surface level. Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Philadelphia, that's American heritage. But when we look, as we move west, it kind of drops off. And then you kind of get to California, Oregon, and Washington. There's some, but it's far from few. And there's some irony there too, because if we talk about again how our laws started, the Antiquities Act, as Americans moved west, the laws were starting to come into existence to protect archaeological sites that we had, yet that same law that's to protect these things, as we move later on to our history of laws, drops off when it comes to the national preservations. The Southwest here has tons of resources, has essentially nothing on the register. I mean, clearly there's stuff on the register if you look at the color scheme, but far from few. And that begs a huge question about why. We also see this to some extent in parts of the South where predominantly Black communities have resided. And this has been a huge issue in general with the National Park Services and with federal laws, because for the longest time, Black heritage has not been protected or appreciated or evaluated by cultural resource managers and archaeologists or the federal government. So properties, buildings, places that communities in the South, Black communities in the South had, resided in or have contributed to, are not being protected. And there's a huge reckoning right now within in the archaeological community to address and to remedy this issue, but we're still far from getting there. And that can be seen here as well. Here's what that looks like within the state of California. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt again. Can I
You're
ask
good.
a question about that previous map?
Yeah.
Do you think that, the valuable resources in the Southwest, and thinking about minerals especially, like, would the NRHP prevent the extraction of those by corporate interests, or I'm thinking about like Navajo Reservation, uranium, things like that. Like if the NRHP was more implemented in the West, would that prohibit? Do you think there's something going on there in terms of keeping those resources free for profit?
It could be. So when we talk about the Navajo Nation, for example, it's right here, these 3 counties in Arizona. You can see there's nothing there as well. But that's possibly because the tribal entities are their own regulators. They're their own country in theory. And so these laws don't apply to those lands.
Oh, okay.
Because they are tribal entities. Now, tribes themselves have their own, and the National Historic Preservation Act did create, I forgot to mention it, what's known as the SHPO, which is the State Preservation Officer, and also created a position known as the TIPO, Tribal Preservation Officer. Tribes have their own preservation officers who need to be consulted as a result of these federal laws, but consultation does not prohibit the destruction of a site again. It says that you need to do consultations, you need to have agreements, you need to discuss potential mitigation, and you hope that the agency in good faith will adhere to those recommendations, but they're not required to. Again, so our laws still are a little weak in that sense, unless you're talking about state law, in which, as I said, CEQA does require that you take mitigation. You cannot go against what the recommendations are for mitigation and harm.
Thank you.
And so here in California, you can kind of see ours is, again, Southern California, Los Angeles, in the Bay Area. Other parts of the state, far from few. One would argue, though, there's a lot of native heritage that's not, being reflected here as well. So criteria A, when you're doing the nomination, is an event. So this, as it says here, to be considered for listing under criteria A, property must be associated with one or more events important to the, in the defined historical context. A single event or pattern of events, and a mere association with a historic event or events or trends is not enough in itself, and to qualify under criteria A, a property's specific association must be considered important as well to the national history. And when you do these things, very often you have to do it in a very narrow category. You can only focus on one component. You cannot focus on multiple. So I'll kind of get into that a little bit later if I have time. And so the basic process in determining this, so if a place is under criteria A, is to essentially determine the use and the origin of the property, identify the historic context with the property, sorry, it's cut off, and then evaluate the property's history to determine whether it is associated with a historic context in an important way. Does anyone know where this is? Anyone?
I don't think so.
Does this help? No?
Philadelphia.
Yes, this is Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Here's an example of a property that would be nominated under criteria A of trying to get it on the National Register. It already is, but this is just a very easy example of a concept of an event. This one less obvious. It looks like a property that you'd see and dismiss and you wouldn't care anything about. Until you realize that it's part of something a lot more important. This property was a part of the Underground Railroad. It's a reminder again that looks may be deceiving because some of these properties are so old, but that does not mean they're not warranted to look into. And that's why you have to investigate to determine these things. Because again, one might say this is an eyesore and they might want to remove it until you then find out it's played a huge significant role of an event within U.S. history, being that of the ending of slavery and the fight of what was the term they called them? Those who fought against slavery. They were the abolitionists. Thank you, the abolitionists fighting against the slave state. So, criteria B is a person. A property associated with an individual whose specific contributions to history can be identified and documented. Person significant in our past refers to individuals whose activities are essentially significant to some type of pattern within U.S. history, events, so forth. Essentially the basic process for this, very similarly determine the importance of the individual who resided in the property, ascertain the length and the nature of their association with the property, and then essentially once that's been done, you can evaluate it under criteria B. Any idea whose house this is? Probably not, but an important person, Martin Luther King Jr. Again, I try to choose the most easiest examples of how these criteria are applied, but it doesn't take a lot of effort to see why him living here would be, again, of importance for us to preserve this property. His contributions to the United States changed so much. Yes?
Do you know when this photo was taken?
Of the house or of
The
Martin Luther
house.
King? No, I do not, but it is on it's actually not even on the National Register. It's a National Historic Landmark, so it's, there's a tier system that's like the class up. There's even more protections. If you're a National Historic Landmark, you are given a little bit more protection in which any type of change to the project needs to be evaluated by Congress as well. Consultation with the United States Congress has to occur. And there's a lot more political pressure because even though NEPA and these other laws, NHPA, don't prohibit, when you do have the aspect of having to consult Congress and the politics gets involved, it can prohibit a project transfer or a project because Congress allocates funds. So Congress could choose not to give the appropriations to a permit or to fund a project that could destroy that property. So being able to consult Congress can have some benefits. And then criteria C, which is design and construction. properties may be eligible for National Register if they embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or represent the work of a master, or that process high artistic value, or represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. The process here is to determine if a building embodies a distinctive characteristic of a type, period, and then to ascertain who the architect was if possible. And then you would evaluate under criteria C. So for example, these properties here, some people may recognize this one, those who spend time in Northern California, that is. This architectural style is called Queen Anne, very popular in the 1890s. And then down here, you may have recognized this one's in San Francisco, and this is somewhere in the Bay as well. This is actually, ironically, the really only distinctive building type unique to California, specifically the Bay Area. It's called the Bay Area model. There's 3 versions of it, and it's only found here in the Bay Area with this wooden shingles, slanted roofs or flat roofs, and this weird shaped design.
It's like the houses in the city.
Yes, Sea Ranch is a great example of it. You see a lot of them at Sea Ranch. Those are all that type, which are all nominational because it's very unique as a characteristic to this type of design and style, because again, it's only found here in the Bay Area. So all those properties could be nominated under the National Register under criteria C because of that uniqueness to them. Yes?
Is the upper right the Benbow Inn by chance?
I don't know the name of it, but it is in Eureka, California. I wish I remember, but I've seen it before. Yes? Yes, that is on the National Register of Historic Places. For a person, C, criteria B and C, for structure and person. So you can have more than one criteria when you nominate. Later on, when it comes to the national narrative, though, it needs to be very tailored to one narrative. So nomination, you can have 2. At the end, it's going to be 1 when presented. So here's examples of what that process looks like. Here's another example of a report I did. I was nominating this house here in Santa Rosa for the National Register of Historic Places. It may not look impressive, but again, looks are deceiving. This specific house, it was nominational. I have it here, as I wrote, under criteria C and A, because it was a pyramidal cottage with a hipped roof, which is very unique, and was characteristic of a specific period of time of urban development in Santa Rosa as the railroads came in. So I just wanted to provide a visual of what this actually looks like, since we've kind of talked about it, what the paperwork looks like. You'll fill it out, it's very similar. You still have that primary record form as all archaeological reports do, and then you have the building structure record. And then a lot of the things you'll see I wrote refer to continuation sheet, because the process then kind of gets a bit long. So you, like other ones, you provide a sketch map, you provide a location map of the property. Then you have to go into evaluating the history of the property. And so what I had to do here is I went to the Sanborn Insurance Maps, which was a very useful tool in establishing the property's history from when it was at least first documented. So we here have on the left, this property was first seen on the insurance map in 1904. And then you can see the house, how it's changed over time here. And I think this was 1950. The property expanded, they added more to it, but it's still within the same parcel. So it's a process. And then once you've done that, you've provided that support, you now have to write about the property. And that means looking at the facade of the house and talking about the windows, the wood, all the materials. This is a part that why you have to go and learn about it in classes, because they don't expect you to know the jargon. And I had to take a whole class on building architecture, which I never thought I would as an archaeologist, but here I was. After that, you then have to write, again, from your perspective, you have to present a case. why is it significant? So I then had to write up, from my perspective, why I believed it to be significant, and then I have to provide it essentially the argument. So now I've provided some of the clues and details. Now I have to go into talking about the history. I had to talk about the funding of Santa Rosa, talking about Maria Lopez, the essentially founder of Santa Rosa, her land grant, how her land grant was then later sold so that private entities can then develop the city of Santa Rosa. I had to go find documents. So here she is, the founder of Santa Rosa. This is her original house that was photographed in 1937. I had to find this. No longer exists. Yes?
So as mentioned on the previous slide, was that like, was that like, an assignment?
Yeah, so my final for this class, this architecture class, was to nominate this property. So I had to do all this and then turn it in and then submit it to the keeper. That's what they call the person who oversees the register, and to the state records. But so, you know, you have to do a lot of investigation. This I did through looking into the archives. Again, you have to present a case because it needs to be able to fit that it has national significance, and it's your job as the archaeologist to actually present that argument, that case. And so I had to find, you know, deeds and selling of land grants. I had to find initial parcel maps, and here's the first map drawn of Santa Rosa as it's being sold off to be developed for later purpose, from the original land grant from Maria. From there, I had to then talk about how Santa Rosa developed, the history of it, again, to emphasize the importance of this house to that period of time. And then I had to talk about the structure. Why is the structure of the house important? Then last part of it is you have to talk about the people who resided there just to make sure that it's not under criteria B, but that does require you to still talk and acknowledge the residents. And so the person who owned this house, he met his wife in World War I as a nurse, and I had to find all this records through, again, archives. Here's all the property owners, because you have to provide that as well. The renters, and then the landowners, and then the last part, which is the most important, the final summary, again, of its evaluation and why it deserves to be nominated. And as you say, as a result, the Hudson House, I had provided the address, but I blanked it out, is sufficient under criteria so and so. So this is exactly what we do. That's what the process looks like. That you always, important, learn to write citations because you can't get away from them. You always have to provide your sources. And I want to kind of bring it to an end here about the national conversation about cultural heritage management. We see here as an aerial of the White House on the left, and here's it today with the east wing of the White House being demolished. I wanted to talk about it because it is a moment that is captivating the country, and it is bringing the idea of cultural heritage preservation to the forefront of the American conscious. And a lot of people are upset about this, and a lot of people said, how is this possible? Unfortunately, our laws are interesting in that Section 106, again, it's a procedure, it doesn't prohibit. And not only that, it's actually written, National Historic Preservation Act has 3 exemptions. The White House, the Capitol, and the Supreme Court building are the 3 properties that are exempt from historic overview under the law. So the White House, unfortunately, is not protected by our laws. It's exempt. So that's one example of how the administration was able to unilaterally demolish the East Wing without consultation. Now, hopefully there are still remedies because there are still regulatory things within the District of Columbia that still need to be enforced. But in terms of federal law, it's fine. So that's why there's always like a tiered system. So federal law, they get away with it. Now, whether or not regulatory laws in the District of Columbia, there may be hope for some type of litigation because it is a property of mass significance, but unfortunately, the Congress, when they wrote these laws, did not, I don't know whether they foresaw this being ever a thing, but they did make it very clear that it was exempt. But it doesn't end there, so here's just another visual, sad. Another contentious property under current debate. Here is legitimately a screenshot of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This is a government website. This is not a joke website. This is the actual government. Make Alcatraz great again. It is a great example of another property that's been thrusted into the national consciousness that again engages with our cultural resource laws that have people asking, is it possible? What will happen? Well, unfortunately, it is again a bit complicated. As I had stated, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, it is definitely a property that falls under this. So any type of change, destruction does fall under the law. So Alcatraz will have some more protections than the White House did. So in theory, the federal government, upon transferring it from the Department of Parks and Recs, the Department of National Park Services to the Bureau of Prisons, that transition in itself will first involve Section 106 being activated, which means the federal agency is responsible for consulting the California State Preservation Officer, tribal officer, because this has indigenous heritage as well, and the state can actually speak through the tribal officer as well, so the state can, voice its opposition, because it's one of those unique situations where it has significance to state heritage as well as national heritage. Yes?
Is there a pathway to kind of forcing CEQA?
Yes, so I've looked into this. Yes, so that's where this is where again, federal and state. If CEQA were enacted, it would almost unilaterally end the project of it being transferred over because of, again, mitigation. Because to make this an active prison means modifications to the historic integrity of the facade of the structures and anything like that, which again is protected in the law. So it would still go through this. It would still go through Section 106. So the agencies would discuss. Then there is Section 110, which does say that it is incumbent on the administration, whoever owns it. So in this part, the National Park Services, to maintain its historic integrity as well. So Section 110 does add more obstacles than 106 review, but sadly, it can go through. Unless CEQA were to get enacted, in which there are questions, because that would imply that if the federal government wants to transition Alcatraz into an active prison, it needs to do it without any state funding. The state cannot be involved at all, because if the state were to be involved, CEQA would be enacted instantly. If the federal government wanted to do anything to the coastline on the island, from the docks or anything, CEQA would be enacted, because they'd have to go through the California State Coastal Commission. Yes?
Just to clarify, so, okay, so as far as Alcatraz is not active.
No, it is not active. It is it is a national landmark. It's actually lumped in with the Golden Gate Bridge and the Presidio. They're actually one entity. They're all part of, and that's the other part. It's a national landmark, so it's beyond just being nominated, it's beyond just being on the register. It has status as national landmark, which then requires congressional consultation. So if Congress were to have a huge political pressure put on them, they could stop this entirely through not providing the funds, again, to modify the construction of the project if political pressure was there. And this does actually, believe it or not, this does happen, and I don't have an image because I wasn't planning to talk about it, but since it came up, Point Reyes National Seashore is a great example, and ironically was nominated by a faculty at Sonoma State. She no longer is there, she's retired, but she used to be the department chair for this program. And a large part of her process to nominate was lobbying in Congress and getting Congress involved and having testimonies done. And it was passed through that process. So it does demonstrate how political pressure from the public can persuade, usually, Congress. And usually things like this tend not to get overtly partisan unless other characters insert themselves into the conversation in which it can. Yes?
So if funds were given to Alcatraz, could that mean that it could be an active prison again?
Yes. The federal government has every right to, because it still owns the property. As I said, sadly, the laws do not prohibit destruction. It would delay its opening for quite a while because they still have to follow federal law in this case because it's not exempt like the White House is. So they would still have to do the procedure. They'd still have to do the consultation. They'd still have to sign an MOA, which I didn't really talk about, but that is like kind of a legal document. It's an agreement in which members do sign. And typically, usually in most of these cases, they try to adhere to what MOAs say or what the mitigated costs are, because again, they don't want to necessarily be put in this image of destroying something that the public has deemed. And the benefit is, as Alcatraz has been a national landmark with hundreds of visitors, that come through, it does have national interest. And this is one of those situations where if enough of the public are really turned off by the potential harm, because once it's active prison, it's no longer visible. Like, you can't go see it anymore. It's no longer a part of the ability for the American public to engage in our national heritage. And that would probably upset a lot of people. And then, because I had to, because it was just within this last 48 hours that this one then also is now under attack. Does anyone know this building? Yes, this is the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. It was built in commemoration of the assassinated President John F. Kennedy. It has long played a national significance. It was nominated to the National Register in 2012, actually pretty recent, ironically. But it is a National Register property, so Section 106, 110, they all apply to this, but it is unclear its future because it does sound like the ambition is to essentially demolish the building, is what I'm getting out of what is coming out of the White House, is to, I don't know, do I have a picture now? Is to gut the inside of the Kennedy Center, repurpose it, put new marble, put new steel. It's very questionable what will happen because, again, it doesn't have the same protections as state laws. But this one has a lot of politics tied to it, so it's very unclear what will happen. I believe Congress would also have to weigh on this one as well. So that does prohibit, again, unilateral destruction. And if the federal government were to proceed doing this without consultation, without following Section 110, they could be in a lot of legal peril. So they can't just speed run this and do it unilaterally. It will be slowed down. So whether or not it will be touched or changed is to be seen in the future. Yeah?
But if Congress is basically one-sided now, doesn't that mean that they would agree with the president and demolish the building, or not?
It's possible. We would have to see. I mean, it's one of those moments where it's hard to tell. We are entering a year where there will be a midterm election in which would members of Congress be willing to put their candidacy on the line over touching the Kennedy Center. Whether that is enough to upset people, it's really hard to assess at the moment. We do have a sense that people are very disgusted about the White House. A lot of people seem to have been upset by its quick speed and its unilateral decisions to be demolished without any type of oversight. And it has raised the question about whether or not Congress should have played a role. It's one of those moments where maybe we may see some amendments to Section 106. We may see amendments to some of these laws if, groups or nonprofit organizations want to start lobbying. This would be the time to lobby Congress members to enact amendments to the laws to provide stricter regulations. We've never had this kind of contentiousness with these laws before, so they've kind of flown under the radar until recently.
So there's nothing that can prohibit him, I'm saying
Mhm.
him,
Yes.
because it is him doing it.
Yes.
He's scheduling it for the 4th of July.
So
There's no law anywhere that can prohibit any type of building permit or any type of, because normally when you
yes.
are going to do any renovations or any type of building, you have to apply for a local government
Yes.
building permit.
Yeah, so that's where we would hope that, so federal law would only, again, slow it down. It's not gonna prohibit any type of remodeling. This is where we would hope that, and I don't know DC's regulatory code, so this is where if a CRM person was working with a firm, this is again how CRM practitioners are also very engaged in law. So as I said, you have a wide variety of ways to get involved in the field to essentially cater to your interests. If you're very invested in law, this is a great place to go if you want to protect things. You would have to see what the district codes say, because it is still has to follow not just the federal law, but it also, and this is not a state, but district codes. So there is a chance that district codes would also prohibit it. That's kind of what the current legal argument might be for the White House, is that although the executive branch has the ability to do what it did and law does not prohibit it, and it didn't need to consult Congress allegedly, not sure about that, but there are still district laws that they had to follow. So, I mean, I didn't also add this, but I guess there's one other thing that I heard the other day. The Trump administration wants to build a arch in DC, like the one in
Champs-Élysées.
Yes, like an arch. Yes, and allegedly the proposal is it's going to be as tall as the Capitol Dome. In DC, under federal law, nothing can be actually taller than the Capitol Dome. So it would be an eyesore because it would be ginormous. But the benefit is there are other laws that would probably stop that. On local levels, for example, there are zoning. When you have a historic district, for example, in Petaluma, and I can give a contemporary example, Petaluma was in the process of permitting a hotel to build itself right there in downtown in the little historic court, and it was supposed to be about a 4-story tall hotel, and you know, their process. And one of my professors, he's now retired as well, he is on the Petaluma committee for historic whatever, and he's an archaeologist, and he opposed permitting it because technically it would violate the law, because one of the things in a historic district that you have to take into consideration is visual integrity of the historic property or district. So if you put a 4-story building, it is visibly seen throughout the whole premises. That actually has an impact on the historic integrity of the historic district within itself. So under the law, essentially, if that visual eyesore of a 4-story building destroys the historic character or integrity of a historic district, it's prohibited under law, and at least in the state of California. So luckily enough, it did not pass. So there are those type of regulations that do exist that can prohibit things like that. So I think that is, yeah, that's it for me. I also provided some little additional sources for, you know, looking at those laws closely. Any questions? Yes.
I have a question, like, what advice do you have for students who, like, are looking to get into cultural resource management and, like, pursue that as a career? Like,
Yeah. So I would suggest personally majoring in anthropology. However, as you can see, you can also major in history. You can major in law. There are a lot of different avenues. I feel like anthropology, you're going to get more of a broader range of you know, courses that will help improve your ability to do this sort of work. So really just going out, I mean, you don't necessarily need a master's to work at a CRM firm. You could even probably work in one without it as a field tech. There are firms all over the Bay Area, from Stantec to the Anthropological Studies Center at Sonoma State. There are firms everywhere, and they are always hiring for people to go out in the field, as I had way back here, doing field surveys, because project managers can never be bothered because they have to write the reports, and that takes time. So, they want people doing this kind of stuff out in the field. Rarely do you trench, but you still do sometimes. Usually it's for mitigation purposes, but usually a preliminary survey you don't. But yeah, that's what I would suggest doing, and then, then just start looking at the different places. There is the California Society of Archaeologists that are meeting this March, I think March 10th. Students, the public can attend. There's a fee, but students have a reduced fee. I think it's $50. It's in Palm Springs though. But they have job fairs there where they have all these firms across the state of California come, and they have sheets, cards, you can get their numbers, so it's hiring in that sense. And you can then see and engage with other archaeologists and CRM professionals in the field and see what their work they're doing. And a lot of it's through just knowing people. Do you get somehow sucked into doing things? Any other questions? Yeah?
Now, what did they say they were gonna build the cemetery candidate?
So they didn't necessarily say they were gonna build something new, but they said they're going to close it for 2 years to do renovations. But when you hear the way that the renovations were described, they were described in a manner in which they were gonna just totally demolish it and build something new. It sounded like they were like, all that will be left are a few marble steel pillars, and everything else will be new. So to be determined what will happen there. But yeah, any other questions? No? Yeah?
Oh, sorry.
No,
You
yes.
go first. I was just gonna ask if you would be willing to be available after this lecture in terms of providing contact information in case students have more questions or wanna talk to you more about getting into cultural heritage management.
Yeah, I'll be around.
Do you know what the arch would be?
Oh, no, because, well, I mean, I did, like I said, I recently just heard about it. I haven't looked into it. As I was doing this last end of this presentation, I was like, oh gosh. I was like, I kept finding things, yeah. I have no idea, but it's supposed to be massive. Everything he does needs to be, I mean, the East Wing that was built in the 1970s by the Lyndon Johnson administration and had served the First Ladies was a really large part of White House history. It had a huge significance. I mean, that's where the Rose Garden was. The Rose Garden is gone. Again, these were places that held long-standing importance to identity of American history. I mean, the idea of what the White House is, the office of the presidency were tied to these components of a building. Just shows you buildings have a lot of significance, but it is now being a two-story, like it's huge project that's done through private investment, which also could be a potential legal obstacle as well. Which this arch is actually apparently not being funded by Congress, but is allegedly going to be funded by private donors. But I don't know how the federal government will access land for it. DC is very limited in space, and tends, when it does take up space, it's for national monuments to commemorate stuff, and it's unclear what this would be commemorating. I guess there's an argument that the 250th anniversary of the U.S., but that's a very unlikely thing since it wouldn't be finished by then. Yeah. Any other questions? Nope. That's it. Jesse, you take over.